Hey everyone, this is Lori Barnes from Kepler College and Cindy McKean, and we are back for our third episode of Let's Talk AstroMapping, number 3. Super excited. So today, Cindy is going to talk about destiny points.
Hi, I'm Cindy McKean. I am an instructor of astromapping at Kepler College, and I am the world's top expert in astromapping techniques, whether it's astrocartography or local space or whatever way that we're looking at the Earth from an astromapping point of view. And today I wanted to talk about destiny points. We have several different kinds of destiny points around the world, and there's about 6 different kinds, and I'll get into that in a minute, but we're going to talk about half of them today. So today is part 1. This is all about our superpowers and really how we could find not just our power places, but our superpower places where life will inevitably have quite a change in those locations.
I am super excited to hear about destiny points. So why don't we get started?
This is going to be part 1 of 2. And when we're talking about destiny points around the world, we have around 6 of them. So one of them would be where we would find astrocartography lines that cross each other. I'm going to get a little bit more into that when differentiating what do I mean by crossings, because we could unanimously use the word crossings for anything that crosses on this list here. I put them in order here according to strength. Astrocartography crossings are probably some of the most powerful places in the world. And I will explain why. The next one are when you go to an astrocartography line, your own astrocartography line in an eclipse path. And the reason it's so powerful is because the rarity, it's temporal as well as spatial. So the rarity of you being in that exact path where you have an astrocartography line will actually amplify the power of that line, and it could go on for years. Same thing with ACG crossings, by the way. They tend to be turning points. Then we have zeniths, and that's where, from the celestial sphere technique, and that's astrocartography, where the planets are going to be at 90 degrees away from the horizon. So it would be directly hitting over your head. And astrologically and astrocartography, those are profound. Then we're looking at local space lines crossing over astrocartography lines. This is where we bring 2 different techniques. And the local space lines are horizontal point of view rather than the celestial sphere point of view. So it's looking at the sky from your latitude, and that actually does change your perspective of what you could see in the sky, especially when it comes to geospatial aspects. But when they cross over in ACG lines, those are also very powerful. Now, I know Parans gets a lot of popularity on the internet simply because there was, I guess, the trend that people believed about latitude lines that were destiny lines. I'm not sure where that started and why that started. I do see that there was some miscommunication or things that could be misunderstood from some of the texts, but really I'll get into that and we'll see that it's not a Paran line, it's a point. And that's what makes it so magical. And then finally, midpoints. And midpoints work a little bit differently in astrocartography because we're looking at places between 2 lines, and we could actually look at that more geographically. So today we're going to cover half of these, and the half I'm going to do is the ACG crossings. I'm also going to do local space lines crossing over ACG, and then I'm going to do Parans. And what are these places? What's the big deal about these places? It's fate, it's energy, it's change. You may feel called to these places. If you go there, most certainly you're going to feel the energy and it's going to play out in your life. So we'll start with, remember I talked over here about local space lines crossing over ACG. My first example has to do with Jack Nicholson. And he might be someone familiar to you guys. He's still alive today. I think he's 87 years old. And he's quite a versatile actor. He's been in a lot of different roles in a lot of different decades in films that I can't even count. But if we looked at his map and his chart, we have his natal chart here right in the center. He was born in Neptune City, New Jersey. So the overlook, he was born over here. And I want to focus over what happened in Los Angeles with him, where he has a Chiron line. So I'm going to just zoom in. We know this is his natal chart here because if we're looking at Venus, we could see it's close to the midheaven. And where he would have lived in New Jersey, that Venus midheaven line is right there. And it's kind of interesting because he has Venus and Aries, and he's known as like rugged, and he has that allure to him as like the dark male or the troubled male type of thing. But what's really interesting is when he was born in Neptune City, New Jersey, even though Venus was there, but at high noon, just coming up, rising on the horizon was his Chiron. And we could see that in the form of a Chiron ascendant line. If we zoom in, we could see it right over Los Angeles. I'm also adding his local space lines because that's the topic of the destiny point that we're talking about. So this is just his local space line. His kind of spreads out like the wheels on a spoke. And this is AstroGold, by the way. When they do their lines on the map, they're not differentiating superior lines versus inferior lines. By that, I mean it's not differentiating whether this orbit is happening on the other side of the Earth or in the visible sky above us. So I'll point out what that means. But here we combine both charts. And if we look into the LA area, we could see that one of his local space lines crosses over his Chiron line. And here I zoom in on that. That's his north node crossing over his Chiron.
Just to clarify, the north node line that we're looking at is kind of like going diagonal. That's from his local space chart. And then the one coming down, that's the actual astrocartography line. Is that right?
Correct. So if we're looking from his point of birth, we could see that he has north node. From his point of view, I mean, if we zoom in here, if he was looking more westerly, the north node, it would have been on the west horizon on the azimuth there. And the azimuth is that 360, where the horizon is, where the sky meets the land, rather. And that would be the distance that you could see. You know, it goes on for the whole world, but we have flat maps. We have Mercator maps that we use in astrocartography. If we put this into globe version, you would see it's like a whole basket around them. This is his Chiron on the ascendant ACG line. And we have that separated out over here with Chiron on an angle. So when we combine those two together, that's how we could see it. And then I'm going to zoom in on that spot in California, and there we go. I myself couldn't help but always focus back at what's happening over Bakersfield. Of it looks like it's Chiron over Chiron. And it is, but this is an inferior Chiron, local space line, this more horizontal type of line. And the reason that we know it's horizontal, that it's the inferior line, is if we look at his local space chart. And I'm going to zoom in on that. Remember, I said if we look westerly, so the local space chart is always facing north, 0 degrees is north. This would have been the line that went over him, essentially. So the inferior line. What's really interesting about his chart is the reason why it's a destiny point is because his fame, his upcoming, his rising in Hollywood, it made some journalists really interested to know more about him because he is kind of a mysterious guy. He has this like, you don't know, is he really in character or out of character as he's doing his acting? And he's so versatile, you don't know which one is really him. And he's a solid Taurus, by the way. But when he was 26 years old and he was an up and coming star, the journalists that did the investigation, well, they published a story about him. And it was pretty profound. He had an older sister. His sister was 17 years older than him. And when they dug into his past, they actually found out his sister was actually his mother. According to him, and these are his words from a biography, he said, I'd say it was a pretty dramatic event. but it wasn't what I'd call traumatizing. After all, by the time I found out who my mother was, I was pretty well psychologically formed. As a matter of fact, it made quite a few things clearer to me. If anything, I felt grateful. So sometimes Chiron gets a bad rap that it's going to be like your wound, but oftentimes I found on Chiron lines, it could be about taking care of your wound. And in Jack Nicholson's case, it was him feeling grateful and things being clarified in his life. Because it's tied to his North Node, that's his heritage. When he found out, his mother had already passed away. So it's even more profound because we're looking at ancestry that he might not have known about. If we look at the mythology of Chiron, he was abandoned by his mother. Now, Jack Nicholson wasn't abandoned by his mother, but definitely her role was greatly changed. I mean, a sister is not a mother, a sister is a sibling, right? They could be your pal. Yes, they could be maternal towards you, but a mother is a mother, right? So, another thing that I looked at with Jack Nicholson is I like to look at synchronicities and I look at names. I see if there's things that might hook up. And it kind of piqued my curiosity that he was born in Neptune City. So I said, wow, I wonder what Neptune is doing in his chart. And here I relocated his chart and I only included Neptune and it's Neptune, North Node, and Chiron. And what's really interesting is that Neptune is connected both in his natal chart, but of course it's going to persist in his relocated chart in a T-square. It's the apex to a T-square where Chiron is opposite his North Node. And it moves from his second house in his natal chart to his fourth house. Usually Neptune is about invisibility. It's about things that are going to remain hidden. But it was because of this destiny point that it ended up becoming surfaced. Had he not gone to this destiny point, if he went somewhere else, or if this destiny point was located in another spot, maybe this would have never been uncovered. But I think you could see how profound it is when a local space line crosses over an ACG line in someone's location. And when they're there, how could it affect their life?
You factor in the local space line, the Chiron local space line. And I know it's going through Bakersfield, but do you see that as in range within the orb? And do you factor that in at all, or are you kind of leaving that out of this picture?
Oh, that would be factored in. But you know what's really interesting? Because remember how I said it was an inferior line, and we could see that just by looking at the local space chart. All he said about it was that, yes, it was dramatic, but not traumatic, and it made things clear. He never discussed it beyond that. That's a big issue when you find out that your sister was really your mother. There's a lot to talk about with that. There's so many memories in our emotional index, right? And he never publicly talked about it. So we could look at it and say, well, this is how he's privately handling it with himself. It's something that would have been shaken up and would have been alive there.
And that Chiron, the local space line above it that's going, you said that one is inferior?
Yes.
So it would have gone all the way around the world. It would have gone east around the world and kind of come back west and gone up and through Bakersfield to make the circle back to the local space chart. That's the direction of the circle.
Exactly. Because what happens is if I looked here, he has Chiron and North Node that jut out both east and then the corresponding colors west. Why? Because it's great circles that we're looking at. And that's really important because it's great circles. If we're looking at a horizontal perspective, in other words, that the center of how the earth spins would be exactly where we're located, that gives us that picture, that perspective there. I don't know if you've ever seen perspective sculptures where if you look at it from the side, it might look like a flock of birds, but then you turn around to the front and it looks like an eye. And that's what happens with local space. If we relocated, if we moved his local space all the way over to California, we would see these lines actually rearrange each other because it's a different latitude and a different longitude, and we're viewing the sky from another direction. But when we're looking at it natally, and this natal line definitely crosses over one of his astrocartography lines, which is the grander view. The astrocartography line is looking at the celestial sphere, how it happens out in space and lands here terrestrially and manifests for us in this world. And when those two happen, there is going to be something going on in his life there. I wouldn't be surprised if he went to the spot over here in Northern California. I don't know what's up there. I don't know if it's desert or if it's actually cities out there. That would have been Chiron and Mars. Something along the lines of Chiron and Mars theme would happen to him. He has a lot of that good Mars energy. I mean, just like even what we know him for, that Venus and Aries is ruled by Mars. How is Mars crossing over his Chiron there? It would be something profound. Maybe even he'll be called to go there or he'll be called to avoid it. I don't know a whole lot about his life. I just looked at this one thing over here and I found out that, I looked at North Node and I read a little bit about him and I'm like, that was it. His discovering the truth about his mother and how that actually made him feel grateful. I don't know if Neptune is involved here, but it is interesting that we do see it involved in the apex in his chart. It's interesting how it ties in with like uncovering his mother, uncovering his roots. I'm going to move on to Parans next. I know we're kind of out of order with the strength here, but when we talk about the other, they're really kind of chunky and they just didn't really fit here. So we already talked about a local space crossing over an ACG. When we do Parans, all Parans are crossings, not all crossings are Parans. Parans are two celestial bodies that simultaneously are on different angles at the same time. As we know, astrocartography, when we're boiling it down to the basic definitions, it's planets, conjunct, and angles. And they're powerful Parans in that when we have two planets on different angles, how you're getting all that extra angularity. Because if we look at it, Jim Lewis would say that the angles are like sockets and the planets are like plugs. So it's almost like going from 110 volt to 220 volt. Now that we have like two different plugs pushed into possibly two different angles here. Parans are not as strong as crossings. Crossings is something I will cover here in part 1, but I have to cover about the Parans first since they're really pretty popular. And the reason is that they're not as popular or they're not as strong or not as profound as crossings is because Parans are built into our natal promise. We could look at the chart and we'll see a telemic aspect between those planets. And those planets will know how to talk to each other. In other words, you would know how to control that in your life because you were born with that aspect. If you don't have that aspect, it's two planets that are not communicating with each other. And that's a new energy that you would have to learn how to deal with. And because it's something that happens in space but manifests on Earth, that's why crossings are more profound. They're celestial gifts. One of the people that I saw that had a Paran that was pretty profound was John Travolta. And he also was born in New Jersey and he had very big success out of Hollywood. This guy could dance. He could bust a move like no one else. And everybody loved watching him. And he happened to be a bit charming as well. I always thought he was a Libra or had a Libra ascendant because of his prominent chin dimples. But as it turns out, he's actually an Aquarius. And he has a Cancer rising, by the way. If we look at his astrocartography map, and we're only going to be using astrocartography when it comes to Parans, because we're looking at planets that are conjunct angles. This is his relocated chart to California. He was born nearby his Chiron descendant. In Hollywood, he's very close to a Paran. So I'm going to zoom in on this for us. In that Paran, we could see that there's a crossing. The orange sloping line is Jupiter on his ascendant. And this dashed dark gray line is Pluto on his IC. Now, here's something. It's not exactly here on his IC, but once we start to study at KeplerCollege about how planets are working, Pluto has quite an incline compared to our celestial plane. So Pluto is actually a bit of an exception here, but it's not conjunct the angle in his natal chart. But we will see that here it actually is conjunct his angle when we're looking at the astrocartography aspect of it. And the reason why is because astrocartography takes right ascension into consideration, and it actually more properly places the planet nearby where it is. So if he happened to be born in the LA area, he might think that Pluto is not so strong on his IC, but actually, as it turns out, Pluto is pretty much right there. He's only like 62 miles away from this crossing. It is definitely going to have an effect. And if we're looking at the lines here, this is his sun on his midheaven. And yeah, he is with an orb of that sun. And of course, we could see in the relocated chart that the sun would be close to his midheaven. Sun at high noon, close to Los Angeles. That's the sun, the light shining down on him. I mean, that's one of the indications of fame for him. However, Jim Lewis, one of the things he said about a Jupiter and Pluto Paran, and we could look at it too when we look at midpoints between Jupiter and Pluto, is according to him, when you put those two planetary energies together on angles, what you get, you don't win the lottery, you win the jackpot. You win super big. If he had this line over exactly over Las Vegas, we could tell him, you know what, put a coin in the slot machine and you probably are going to hit the jackpot out there. With him, what happened with him? He ended up becoming a huge actor out of Hollywood. Well, he's really out of the Northeast, but it's Hollywood that made him again, right? This is a good example of a Paran, and it's a point. It's exactly a spot. And we could go within an orb. Some people say don't go more than 75 miles. I would say it really depends on the planet. We have to look at the planets involved, and we have to look at the person's chart as a whole. And we have to look at the latitude that they're in. Because if they're closer to the equator, we could make it a bigger orb. 75 to 100 miles, I would say, would be the orb. And like I said, he was only 62 miles away from this point. For sure, it's hitting him. What's really interesting is that we could see Parans in the chart just by a glance. And that's what I'm talking about, where you could just kind of glance at the map and you could see it reflected in the chart. So over here, it would be Jupiter, that sloping orange line, and the sun on the midheaven, which is that straight darker yellow or lighter orange type of line. If we could imagine just turning the dial a little bit, that would put sun right at the MC, and it would keep Pluto on his ascendant. Or if we look down here, where this pink line is Venus. It's a Venus midheaven. It's a solid straight line. The straight lines are the meridians, by the way. And there is that sloping Jupiter on the ascendant. Over here, again, we can reimagine it if we went down there, Jupiter on the ascendant, and it would move Venus closer to his midheaven there. In other words, these are things that we could always see in the chart. What's really interesting is we could only find out by looking. Really, we have to look at the chart. We just can't glance at this and say, oh, it's a Paran, and keep it categorically a Paran.
So you're saying you see these two lines and they cross. You don't know if it's a Paran or if it's a crossing. So you go to the chart, the relocated chart, and you see if there's a Ptolemaic aspect or not. And that's how you figure out if it's a Paran or a crossing?
We could see through either if there's a Ptolemaic aspect or if we could see that it is on the angles here. And again, this is a little tricky. This wasn't the best of examples simply because Pluto is not exactly there on his IC. But again, that's because Pluto's a little bit tricky with its orbit and the incline of the orbit to our celestial plane, the solar plane. So our solar plane is, a straight band, and that is about 18 degrees. And Pluto comes in totally outside of that celestial band, especially at the time that he was born. I think he was born in the mid 50s. and it was already totally outside of the solar band at that point. If he was born 20 years earlier, we would definitely have seen Pluto exactly on that IC because it was in that celestial band, that solar band.
Got it. And so we just have to watch out for Pluto because it has that really different orb compared to the other planets.
Exactly. And another thing we have to look into is that sometimes planets like Venus or Saturn could do the same thing too, because they happen to have a little bit of a slope to them or an incline to them as compared to the celestial sphere as well. So we'd really have to almost go into like the lists and more details, like with declination when it comes to the planets.
What about out of bounds? When a planet goes out of bounds, is that when it can be off of the angle and still have a problem?
Absolutely. You'll notice that we're not within his zeniths here where we could see like where the planet would be at the highest point in the sky. When we were looking at these planets here, we could see if they're on, well, we have to draw the ecliptic. I don't have the ecliptic drawn here, but if they're a little bit off of the ecliptic, that would be our cue to know if it's either out of bounds or if it's at such an incline like Pluto might have. You're going to see that sometimes with certain asteroids as well, like Eris would do that. I wish I added the ecliptic on here, but the ecliptic is the apparent path of the sun. And you could see it's kind of sine wave or parabola too, but it's just like a much wider type of slope. Of course, according to us, when we're looking at the sky, it just looks like the sun rises, gets above our heads, and sets. This slide, by the way, I wanted to talk about Paran lines. And this is one of the things I'd like that we're demystifying at Kepler College, because somewhere along the line there was a miscommunication, and I could see why it was misunderstood that when there's a Paran, it's active on the whole latitude 24 hours a day, and it actually isn't. And the reason for that is that your chart is fixed. So that astrocartography chart, your natal chart, it's fixed. It's that astrocartography line is fixed over the Earth, yet the Earth continues to spin. The world continues to turn. We could look at transiting lines or progress lines, and that would move planetary lines along us. That's where we get movement from the lines, but it doesn't move our natal lines. It's fixed there. It's a snapshot of time. If it doesn't make sense through this type of a graphic, if we could imagine again that celestial sphere and the lines going around it, and our Earth turns, wherever we are, it's an imaginary line, and it's really not activated until we're actually within a degree under this Paran, under this crossing. It's the same for the crossings too, by the way. This is a good point to like bring up the differences between a Paran and a crossing. The reason why we made these straight lines is that when Jim Lewis first released his astrocartography maps, he gave you your map, and he gave you a little booklet, and he gave you a list of cities where there would be Parans and crossings. For some people, it was a little bit cumbersome to look at it. So he said, okay, wherever you see this city on a list, mark your pencil, put an X on the pencil, and then get a ruler and draw a line straight, because that would follow the latitude. And that's what he was talking about, how these lines came about. So that as you're spinning your globe under these lines, you'll know exactly where to look, instead of just like going through these. I mean, sometimes they'd be pages of like lists essentially. And you could easily overlook, the cities that you're thinking about. But it was misunderstood that it would be active the whole 24 hours, and it's not. It's only at the time that we're under it where it actually has an effect. And it doesn't always have an effect on us, by the way. Sometimes the way I describe it is, say that you live on the same latitude of, I don't know, a Pluto and Mars Paran, say Pluto on the midheaven and it's Mars on the ascendant. And you're driving, just as you're rotating under that Parans, as you're driving, someone cuts you off and you have to press on your brakes and you spill your coffee and you're like, effer, blah, blah, blah. Like it ruins your day, right? So it could have that residual effect. Or if we're looking at something a little bit like, let's pretend it's a Venus on the ascendant with moon on the IC, and you're going into your office and you're carrying so much stuff and it's a long day ahead of you, and you're trying to get into the building and you're trying to balance everything as you're trying to open the door, and someone comes and opens the door for you with a big smile and says good morning, and you're just like, oh, that really made my day, that small little thing. And it happened exactly at the time that you were rotating under that Venus and moon crossing. That's really how it works. It's not 24 hours a day, otherwise we wouldn't be able to sleep or really just have a spot where there's no energy. And it actually would, the quote unquote blank spots where there are no line activities, where we would try to run away to. And that's almost impossible to find, especially when we're putting all the lines involved. Parans are different from crossings. Like I said, all Parans are crossings, but not all crossings are Parans. And when does that happen? Parans, angular planets, can be seen in the map and the charts, versus crossings could only be seen in the ACG map. These are sacred, by the way. They're so sacred that people really don't talk about them much. A famous person had an experience on a crossing. Chances are, because it's sacred to them, they're not going to talk about it. You've had sacred moments in your life that you keep to yourself. Maybe it's a moment that you had with your partner, or it's a connection that you had with a child or a parent, or it's something so magnificent that happened at work. You keep those things. It's not exactly secrets, but they're cherished. They're precious moments. It's very hard to get. I had clients that are like that. Of course, the clients are going to be a lot more open about, with their astrologer, about what's going on in the location that they've been in. In my example, I ended up using my husband. He was under his life-changing luminaries. I know this picture might look ominous, but it's actually tied into how his life has changed so much. Like I said, when you're in tune, sometimes you could actually be called to a certain area, or the area calls you. When my husband, when he was a little kid, he used to spin the globe, and where he landed, he would get the encyclopedias out and he would start to look at different spots on the world and read more about them. But he was always really intrigued about this little nub over here that stuck out in the Persian Gulf. I'm putting this for perspective, but I'm going to zoom in on this area over here. And that little nub is Qatar. And he always wondered, like, wow, I wonder, like, why that land persisted, why it's there. And he was always curious, but Qatar back then wasn't really developed. Qatar really started coming into more power, like it's floating on liquid natural gas. So it's turns out to be one of like the extremely rich countries in the world. You might have heard of the United Arab Emirates. It's right next door. Here it is in the Persian Gulf. I mean, we get a lot of oil from these areas. If we zoom in over here, we could see that the sun and the moon are crossing each other. And what's really interesting is that if we're looking at his natal chart, remember I was talking about the telemic aspects? The telemic aspects, like we have to look at, there's 5 of them, right? So it's conjunction, in other words, like right next to each other, opposition, which is 180 degrees away from each other, 2 planets, square, which is 90 degrees from each other, sextile, which is 60 degrees, or trine, 120 degrees. We don't have that in his chart. His are 108 degrees away. What is that? That's a sesquiquintile. And that's not a telemic aspect. It's not like something super major. It's kind of more of a minor type of aspect. In other words, his sun and his moon don't really communicate with each other. And yes, they are trine by sign, but they're definitely not trine by aspect. So what's interesting is if we relocate his chart, his natal chart, to Qatar, and we lived in Doha, Qatar. That's like the city to live in because, I mean, Qatar is very small. I think it's like about the size of Rhode Island, and it's only 2.5 million people. Most of the people, I think 80% of the people, live in Doha. What we could see here is something really interesting. We lived exactly on his sun IC to the minute, like to the degree, right? Exactly placed where his sun MC was in Qatar. And then we look at his moon, and yeah, it's kind of conjunct. I mean, it's a luminary. So we would say that if it's within 4 degrees of an angle, it's conjunct if we're looking at the chart. But that 4 degrees in astrocartography actually equals about 300 to 350 miles, depending on what latitude that you're on. In his case, because we were closer to the equator over here, I mean, we're actually very, very close to the Tropic of Cancer, where this would have put his moon line a lot further away. That 4 degrees is a lot. It's not conjunct an angle, and it's not at an incline the way that Pluto is. I know this might seem confusing because I just showed you a Paran where Pluto was not exactly on the angle, but we could see the astrocartography it was. This one, it's not an incline. So we know that this is actually a crossing. And the profundity of it, if we were to actually draw where the moon should have been according to that 4 degree difference in the chart and that 350 miles away, would have put it right at the edge of the United Arab Emirates. Sure, it would have been within orb of his sun IC, but it's nothing like the two crossing each other. It happens only at this latitude in his chart. And everybody has magical spots like that in their chart. And it might not be the sun or moon. It could be Venus and Saturn. It could be Mars and Mercury. It really all depends. And I've noticed too, from just doing so many clients over the years, that the closer those crossings are to the equator, the stronger it is. And that's because you're getting a more direct hit from those planets. When we're looking at it astronomically, and we're seeing exactly where those planets are placed in the sky. For some perspective, I could tell you, we all might be familiar with the land of the midnight sun, and that's over in the Arctic area during the summertime, where the sun is always above the horizon. And the MC, where it reaches its highest point, might not even go any higher than 8.5 degrees above the horizon. Isn't that still conjunct the horizon? But it's the MC. It is so close to the horizon, and that sun hits you a lot different. And as you noticed, even though it's 24 hours of sun, it is not strong enough to make that area green. It still stays icy because the hit from the light is at an angle. It's not as much heat that could accumulate. As we get closer to the equator, that direct hit will produce heat, it produces energy, it manifests a lot differently for us in our lives. It is really interesting when we learn the astronomy of our lines overall, because when we do, it actually helps us delineate a lot more naturally, a lot easier. We're going to be offering astronomy for AstroMapping for beginners in Kepler. And that's something that is definitely well worth looking into. People are kind of afraid of the astronomy. It's not too hard. We make it easy, of course. It's a beginner's course. And once you learn it, it makes everything so much easier. So don't be afraid of it. Actually look at it as like your secret weapon, so to speak.
I think astrocartography makes astronomy really interesting. If you needed motivation to learn more astronomy, when you start to see the depth of astrocartography, especially if you're bringing in local space as well, like understanding the astronomy around it just brings in so much more meaning. That's what I've learned from studying astromapping, is that I'm now really excited to learn more about astronomy instead of thinking I really need to learn more about astronomy as an astrologer. It's like a mindset shift. It's like, now I want to learn more about astronomy because it's going to help me understand strength or weakness of something. You see something, but there's more to it. There's more underneath that to understand what that line means, the crossing, or if it's a Paran, what they mean.
Yeah, it really brings a lot of automatic information once you learn it. It's less hardcore memorizing of how these lines and energies actually manifest once you know the astrology of it. If we're looking, say, the sun, and the sun is just coming up on the horizon and someone is born at that moment, then we know they're going to have a sun ascendant line going over their location of birth. what does that mean? A sun ascendant line versus if they were born a few hours later and sun was at high noon, and that gave them a sun MC line. That sun rising is a much different energy, a different kind of heat, a different kind of light than you would get from when the sun is up at high noon at its most glorified height, and how much it could affect you. And again, we're having to look at latitude. So if you were born in Alaska, how does that sun MC manifest versus if you were born in Quito, Ecuador, where that sun could very well be exactly 90 degrees above your head? What happened to my husband at this place? It was very life-changing. He got to live the high life there, which was very nice. And we actually got to meet a member of the royal family. And I'm not saying that, there was a symposium and this guy was there. It was one-on-one where we were sitting with one of the Qatari princes. And he actually took care of my husband's test. He took his driving exam there, and there was like a language barrier between him and a teacher, and he failed it. And through some channels and stuff, we were able to get connected. And a lot of this had to do with, if we're thinking luminaries, think celebrities, think high, think people that are, these are the two bodies in the sky that are noticed. Like, you can't not notice the sun. And when the moon is out and in its full glory, you can't not notice the moon either. It was really nice being able to actually meet someone that was in that position. And over there too, my husband, he decided that he was going to change careers. And that was like a big change. He was a New York City attorney, and he decided to become a physician. Hence, we got this little line out there. This is part one. And as you could see, it would take honestly, at least another hour and a half to go over the next 3 most important destiny points across the world for you, especially with eclipse paths, because they're so temporal, they're so time dependent and very place dependent. You can't show up to a place where your astrocartography line is on your eclipse after the eclipse has already happened and expect something from that. It's already gone. That's like showing up to the parade after it's passed. Like, you're just not going to see anything. If you're ever lost, you can consider taking some classes with Kepler College. We'll help you find your way. We have classes in AstroMapping from beginner to intermediate, all the way to advanced, to beyond the advanced extended. And we keep on developing this program more. So please, we would love to see you. You're definitely invited to continue watching our Let's Talk AstroMapping episodes, because we have a lot of rich information. This 3D astrology just is so rich and full that you'll wonder why you never got into it. And you'll see parts of the chart that you'll never be able to see without the AstroMapping.
And we recently have added a practicum, and it will be with Cindy, and that's the advanced class. You will get to practice with Cindy if you take the practicum class, but you'll have to take some of the other AstroMapping courses first so that you can actually do the practicum. So stay tuned. You'll definitely learn more in this series. And when you're ready to step up and get formal education, we would love to have you at Kepler College. We'll see you the next episode. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you, Cindy, for sharing your knowledge. We very much appreciate that. This is Cindy McKean. I'm Lori Barnes with Kepler College, and we will see you next time. Thanks. Bye.
Ciao.